Good morning. Today is Monday, June 8th. I'm Pastor Terry with Tuscola United Methodist Church, and I am so glad that you decided to join us today. So this week we are beginning a new short 5-day devotion, and we're doing one based on the book of Esther, and we're doing this because of everything that has been going on. Esther is one of those amazing books that really allows us to see what racism looks like in other cultures. And sometimes it's easier for us to see it in other cultures than it is to see it in our own. So we're going to be kind of looking at Esther and making some parallels to where we are, and also seeing what it is that God wants of the people in the book of Esther who are struggling with what we call systemic racism. And systemic is a fancy word, but it basically just means that it's part of the systems that are in play. It's maybe not racism in the sense of I'm not going to talk to you, or I'm going to cross the other side of the street when I see you, but these people might have a harder time getting a loan. These people might have a harder time making a higher wage. And in the situation of Esther, we're going to see some pretty nasty systemic racism against the Jews. So if you have not read Esther in a while, my encouragement to you is to read chapters 1 and 2. Right now, we're going to be doing 2 chapters a day, but I will read some of it out loud as we go through it, just to kind of remind us of the story. And we'll talk about it as we go. So in the very beginning, this is Xerxes. Xerxes was a very famous Greek king. If you've ever heard about the Spartan War, Xerxes was the king during this, and he had a very large empire. And during this time, he was also one of the wealthiest emperors. And so what do wealthy kings want to do? They want to show off their wealth. So I love this. He had a 180-day party. How many days do you think that you could enjoy a party before you were just about sick of it? I think I might make it 2, but that's just me. And he displayed, it says, the vast wealth of his kingdom and splendor and the glory of his majesty. Now, when those days were over, he gave a banquet. This one lasted 7 days. And he made sure everybody saw how incredibly wealthy he was. He hung fabrics that were dyed with the most expensive dyes. He had gold goblets. Every guest was to drink with no restrictions. And at the same time that he did this, Queen Vashti was giving a banquet for the women. Now, the king decides that he wants to show off the next thing he can show off, which is his wife. And so he calls her to be a part of this, of his banquet, and she refuses. Now, there are many reasons she refused. There's some lecherous possibilities in there that I'm not necessarily going to discuss, but some things with the Greek that makes us think that he may have wanted her to appear nude, or at the very least, this was not something that was done. The women did not present themselves in front of a room full of men. This was just not, was not good. But because she said no, he threw a fit. Now, I love this. He sits down with his advisors and he says, what do I do? She won't listen to me. Now, what makes me laugh at this is the advisors are, as advisors, I believe, often doing, they are acting in their own best interest, because you see, their fear is that their wives will suddenly begin to say no to them. It says we're in chapter 1, verse 20, then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest, because now you can get cast off if you are not respecting your husband. So that is the setup for the story. We have King Xerxes, who is very, very wealthy, loves to show off that wealth. And you also have a king who listens to his advisors beyond common sense. This is a setup for the rest of the story. So right now, let's go ahead and move on to chapter 2. Chapter 2 is where things start to get good for our story. So he, King Xerxes, happy with his decision until he starts to miss Vashti. And now he wants a new wife. So, of course, his attendants say, let's take care of that. We will go and find all the beautiful young women and bring them to the palace. And then, whichever one pleases Xerxes, that one will be queen instead of Vashti. So, this is where we begin to meet our players. In the citadel of Susa, there was a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai. Mordecai is going to be one of our big players in this, and Mordecai has a cousin named Hadassah. That he brought up, and she was known as Esther. Esther would have been her Greek name. Hadassah would have been her Jewish name. It says she had a lovely figure and was beautiful. When the king's order was proclaimed, Esther, as a beautiful woman, was taken to the palace and won the favor of the head eunuch, Haggai, which was very important because it says here he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. So you definitely wanted to be nice to the head eunuch in the palace. Now, this is where we start to get into some in-depth issues. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Why would Mordecai forbid her from revealing her nationality, revealing her background, unless it was Jewish people were considered less than? Now, just to kind of give you a little bit of historical overstory, these people would have been known as diaspora Jews. These were Jews that had that had been in Jerusalem, and when the Babylonian army took over Jerusalem, they were carried off into captivity. After 70 years, they were allowed to go back to Jerusalem. Many Jews chose not to do this. It had been 70 years. They had no longer had ties or connections. And so many of them went to other places. And so these would have been some of those Jews. They went to the Greek area and set up lives there. But clearly, they are seen as less than because she chooses, and under Mordecai's orders, to not mention this. What would have happened if she had mentioned this? I don't think she would have been killed because at this point, that is not the kind of racism we're looking at. We'll get there. Right now, we are simply looking at systemic racism. The Jews were considered second-class citizens. The Jews might have struggled to get loans. The Jewish businesses would have only been dealt with by Jews. The Jews probably paid an extra tax. This was very common because Jewish people refused to worship the king as a god or other gods, so they paid an extra tax to avoid this. So this is what we call, again, systemic racism. How does that compare with our society now? First of all, if you are a person of color, now there's different types of systemic prejudice, but if we're talking about people of color, that's a really tough one to hide. Esther was able to hide this very important part of herself. But if you are somebody of African American descent or many people of Hispanic descent, you cannot hide the color of your skin. And the thing about it is, it's really hard for those of us who aren't people of color to truly understand. One of the things that I remember thinking years ago when all of this kind of started with the police, well, it didn't start, I'm sorry, when I became aware of it, I should say, with the police brutalities and the stopping people of color, was that the few times I've been pulled over by a police officer, and there have been a couple, I have not been scared. The first time I got a speeding ticket, it was the only time I've ever had a speeding ticket, and I was 22, 23. And I ended up talking to the officer and having a good conversation with him. Even though he ticketed me, I apologized and it all worked out well. Other times two other times I've been pulled over. Once my the sticker had come off, and once I had a headlight out. And both of those times was very, very comfortable situation. I don't have any fear of being pulled over by the police. I was taught as a child, police are your friends. If something happens, go to the police. And how does this compare with mothers who have to sit down and tell their children things like, if the police stop you, do not run. I know you'll be scared, but don't run. If you run, they might shoot you. That's a terrible thing for children to have to hear. Whether they're children who will go on to do crimes or whether they're not, that doesn't matter. If you're talking theft or things like that, it's certainly not worth the value of your life is higher than something that you might steal. So, this is where we get into our systemic racism. Now, just to finish out our story here, Esther does eventually marry the king and becomes the queen. And Mordecai, just to kind of help give him a little bit of a boost, he overhears a plot to assassinate the king and he reveals it. And therefore, right now, Mordecai and Esther are sitting pretty. Esther's the queen. Mordecai has saved the king's life. This is all good. But we know what's coming. So, today, one of the first questions that I just want to ask you, I'm going to ask you a different question every day. And this is a question for you to think about and for you to respond to. Who, when we read the book of Esther, and we're going to kind of go a little ahead because there's lots of this. When you read the book of Esther, who do you identify with? Do you identify with Esther? Are you somebody that is in fear of your life or in fear of being downtrodden? Do you identify with Mordecai, Haman, who we have not gotten to yet, but we will, Vashti, the unnamed strugglers, the king? I think in every story, every parable Jesus gives, every story like this, we have to find who we identify with to see what the message is to us. And while as a woman, my first thought would be to identify with Esther, my life in no way compares with Esther. I have never had to lie about who I am. I've never had to conceal those kinds of things. So think about that some today, and tomorrow we will meet and discuss chapters 3 and 4. If you want to read those before we begin, I encourage you to do so. Have a great day. Bye-bye.